Hello, my name is George. After much anticipation of this debate between Jordan Peterson and Destiny, I was able to take a look at it and definitely had a few things that I wanted to react about some of the topics that they discussed, especially on the climate change debate. That was definitely one of the points that I wanted to pay attention to. And so let's get to it. Let Jordan Peterson speak, and then I will be back.
One of the things I've seen, you tell me what you think about this, something that I've seen that actually shocks me, that I was interested in watching over the last 5 or 6 years. I wondered what would happen when the left, the progressives, ran into a conundrum. And the conundrum is quite straightforward. If you pursue carbon pricing and you make energy more expensive, then you hurt the poor. And I don't think you just hurt them. In fact, I know you just don't hurt them. I heard a man 2 days ago who's fed 350 million people in the course of his life, heading the UN's largest relief agency, make the claim quite straightforwardly that misappropriation on the part of interventionist governments increased the rate of absolute privation dramatically in the world over the last 4 or 5 years. And that has happened not least because of carbon pricing, not just carbon pricing, but the insistence that carbon per se is an externality that we should control. Now, Germany's paid a radical price for that, for example. So their power is now about 5 times as expensive as it could be. And they pollute more per unit of power than they did 10 years ago before they introduced these policies that were hypothetically there to account for externality. And the externality was carbon dioxide. I don't think that's a computable externality. And I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that it's actually an externality that we should be warping the economic system to ameliorate, if the cost of that, and it will be an increase in absolute privation among the world's poor. So, and here's an additional argument on that front with regards to externalities. You get that wrong, and here's something you could get right instead. If you ameliorate absolute poverty among the world's 1 billion poorest, they take a longer view of the future. And that means they become environmentally aware. And so the fastest route to a sustainable planet could well be the remediation of absolute poverty. And the best route to that is cheap energy. And we're interfering with the development of cheap energy by meddling with the hypothetically detrimental externality of carbon dioxide. And so I think this is a complete bloody travesty, by the way. We are putting the lives of hundreds of millions of people directly at risk right now to hypothetically save people in the future, depending on the accuracy of our projections 100 years out. And these interventionists, these people who are remediating externalities, they actually believe that they can calculate an economic projection 1 century out. That's utterly delusional.
Sometimes the left, not religious, but the new religion is climate change. Literally, you have any questions against any pushback against climate change, and they go crazy. They start looking at you like you're the crazy guy from the corner. And no, sometimes you're having serious questions because the way that they want to fix those problems, we have doubts how effective they're going to be. And it is also important to consider how bad humans have been at making predictions on the future. I have this perfect example. Let's say we crack quantum computing in the next 10, 15 years. Like quantum computer, it's available for all the people out there. How is that going to change the world? How is that going to change our predictions and our understandings of our surroundings? Just one thing. How about if we don't actually discover, or we don't get it correct, or at least the cost effective in 20 years? Hey, those things make a difference. And the same with, for example, with fusion. I know right now we're splitting the atom, but once we use fission, that's those are things that change completely our predictions. In predicting 100 years, it is a bit arrogant to believe that.
Media. And I don't think
the reason for the tax is to stop people from pursuing a certain form of short-term gratification at the
For
cost
sure.
of their longer-term well-being.
Correct. And that exact same idea, if you believe climate models, or if you believe that we're heading in a certain direction in terms of climate, the overall warming of the planet, would be the same argument you would make for climate change.
Only if you believe that you could model economic development 100 years into the future.
Well, we're not trying to model. We're more concerned with modeling climate development, than economic development.
We're
yes,
equally
absolutely.
okay. Tell me how I'm wrong. I don't believe that, because what I see happening is two things. We have climate models that purport to explain what's going to happen over a century on the climate side, but we have economic models layered right on top of those that claim that there's going to be various forms of disaster for human beings economically as a consequence of that climate change. And so that's like two towers of Babel stacked on top of one another. And so, because if people were just saying, oh, the climate's going to change, there'd be no moral impetus in that. It's the climate's going to change, and that's going to be disastrous for the biosphere and for humanity. But that's an economic argument as well as a climate-based argument.
It's both, but the worst projections of what would happen if the climate took a disastrous turn are worse than the worst projections of what is our planet going to look like economically if we hardcore police,
Right.
fossil
But why
fuels.
would you? Okay, but
So
I don't understand the
the
distinction
Well, the
between the models.
Well, the argument would be that whatever pain and suffering poor people might endure right now because of a move towards green energy, that pain and suffering is going to be short-term and far less than the long-term pain and suffering.
Right, but
that
that's
comes along
dependent
with,
on the integrity of the economic models and
the climate models as well, right?
Right, exactly,
Of course,
but is in exactly the stacked manner that I described. And like, there's nobody in 1890 who could have predicted what was going to happen in 1990 economically. Not a bit, not a bit. And if we think we can predict like 50 years out now with the current rate of technology and calculate the potential impact of climate change on economic flourishing for human beings, we're deluded. No one can do that.
So we've been measuring the weather since the temperature since the 1600s, and we have been alive for about 200,000 years. That is 0.2%. The audacity and arrogance of us believing that we can make a prediction 100 years out with so many variables, so many different countries, how many different elections, how things can go one side and then go in a different direction because the government changed. We have pandemics, which who would have predicted a pandemic? I mean, let's be honest. You can ask any climate change prediction model. There's no pandemics in between. There's things like that are going to happen that is beyond us, and we have to step back and be like, hey, look, we might not know everything, but we can make an educated prediction, and then we can start organizing, making little change here and there, organizing this thing, and incentivizing certain changes. Hey, if you live in Florida, you live in Texas, anywhere where it's sunny, you should be incentivized to go with a solar panel. That's great. Not in Germany, not in Sweden, not in London. It's ludicrous, and you can see how bad the energy industry has changed in Germany. They're digging coal, and they close all the power plants, all the nuclear power plants, which would have been the safest thing, the safest bet. But nuclear has a bad rep. A lot of people are still afraid of it because of Chernobyl, even though most people don't understand exactly what happened. So, yeah, that's the problem.
And then, it's worse. So imagine that as you do that and you project outward, your margin of error increases. That's absolutely, definitely the case. And at some point, certainly on the climate side, the margin of error gets rapidly to the point where it subsumes any estimate of the degree to which the climate is going to transform. And that happens even more rapidly on the economic side.
Potentially, but I think right now, this is a disagreement on the fact of the matter, though, not the philosophy of what we're talking about in terms of controlling externalities. If we think, I'm curious, let's say that we think we can accurately predict the climate and the economic impact, and we think that the climate impact would be far worse if we don't account for that, both in terms of human conditions.
I don't believe any of those presumptions. I think
but then if you
faulty.
don't, but I mean, like, obviously, if I agreed with that factual analysis, I would probably agree with you on the prescription here too, right?
And that is exactly the problem. The problem is it is very difficult to make predictions so far ahead in time when so many things can change. And the big problem, personally, that I see is it is the planning. If we're not all on board, it is very difficult for us to make the changes, especially when one of the biggest polluters, China and India, are not going to be playing ball with us. Yes, they might, because for them it's more important to develop the country, make sure they take out the people get out of poverty, and then they can make other changes. But let's give an example even on the nuclear side. If we make an advance in fusion, which is smashing two atoms and converting to a new atom, like two hydrogen into a helium, that's gonna be revolutionary. That's going to change any prediction that we have. Like, we're talking about, we can have unlimited energy, and we don't know. I mean, it has been on the frontier for the last 30, 40, 50 years, but we haven't still cracked it. Imagine in the next 10 years we do. Whatever prediction we had today, it's garbage. And that's the point that Destiny fails to understand. That is very important to consider when you want to bring everyone along. And questioning does not make you anti-climate. It just makes you a reasonable person that wants to have a better understanding of what's happening. That's it.
And I thought that none of the climate models were accurate or couldn't accurately predict anything. Then I'd also say why make them?
Well, they're not sufficiently accurate. That's the first thing. And because they have a margin of error, and it's a large margin of error, they don't even model cloud coverage well. That's a big problem. They don't have the resolution. They don't have nearly the resolution to produce the accuracy that's claimed by the climate apocalypse mongers.
People keep saying that, but we just got another one of the hottest years on record. How many times are we going to have another hottest year on record? How many times are we going to have an increase of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere before we're finally like, okay.
I don't know. And the reason I don't know is because it depends. The scientific answer to that question depends precisely on the time frame over which you evaluate the climate fluctuation. And that's actually an intractable scientific problem. So you might say, well, if you take the last 100 years, this variation looks pretty dismal. And I'd say, well, what if you took the last 150,000 years? Or the last 10,000 or the last 10 million? You can't specify the damn time frame of analysis.
I'm talking about the record temperatures that are declared, that have been declared for like the past 5 years, that have also increased with the concentration of parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I mean, I'm not going to tell you that every model is perfect.
They're not
right
perfect.
Now, sure, but right now we're like standing in traffic with our eyes closed saying the car hasn't hit me yet, so I don't think there's any coming. I think it's pretty undeniable at this point that there is an impact on climate across the planet. I
think that's highly deniable. We have no idea what the impact is from. We don't know where the carbon dioxide is from. We can't measure the warming of the oceans. We have terrible temperature records going back 100 years. Almost all the terrestrial temperature detection sites were first put outside urban areas, and then then you have to correct. Then you have to correct for the movement of the urban areas, and then you introduce an error parameter that's larger than the purported increase in temperature that you're planning to measure. This isn't data. This is guess.
So this part right here that we're discussing is definitely slightly above, not slightly, significantly above my research on climate change and on the specific details. So I cannot give him pushback. I'm not sure whether the data that he's providing is correct or not. I have seen other debates where people make different arguments, and based on my understanding is, I think the alarmism that they're having, it's not at the level that it should be, because they're selling you that, hey, we're gonna be dead in the next. You heard people say, oh, we're gonna be dead in the next 10, 15 years, some nonsense. And that is the problem. The problem is, it is hard to take you serious when your predictions are so wrong, or the alarmism that you're creating is not proportionate to the problem. Yes, it could be a problem that we can fix in the next 100 years, but people fail to keep into account the resilience of the human being and how resilient we are to all those things. So I think that's a factor to keep in mind when it comes to the climate change, and look at the things that Japan has done. Japan always dealt with tsunamis, so they have been building enormous walls around certain cities because it happens so often over there that in order for them to survive, they're working around those issues. And it's not necessarily regarding the climate change and melting of the poles or nothing like that. It's just the human resiliency to stay alive and to protect each other. We're gonna evolve and learn new ways how we can get around these issues.